We left off, we began our discussion of the adolescent stage. And again, just for us to keep a mental image, as we talk about adolescence, for the most part, what we're talking about are often we refer to it as the teenage years. And so I think of it in the context of that span, and it is a wide span, anywhere from around 7th grade on through the the high school years. And again, as we discussed the other day, really technically probably goes beyond that, at least into the early college years or the completion of the college years until a person becomes completely independent. But our focus really primarily is thinking of it in the context of those junior high, senior high years. And again, we always want to keep in mind that it's an evolutionary kind of process. Some of we've talked about and we'll continue to talk about some of what appears to be very dramatic changes, and they are in relationship to the previous stage. But almost all of this, are not necessarily things that literally occur overnight. They really do evolve over a period of time. And we were talking about the increase in sexual awareness. And again, I don't want to give the indication that this is something that you wake up with one morning and it's occurred, and it overnight. This likewise, that increasing sexual awareness occurs over this period of time and probably continues at some level to increase and is impacted by many factors. Some youth, it may occur very early on in their adolescent years, and others it may occur a little bit later on, in their life. But it's again not an overnight kind of experience. And again, it is one of those topics that you'll be addressing in terms of your second paper, in terms of what your recollection is, in terms of your own experiences of when you became aware of the other gender and what some of that was like. And again, for some it occurs earlier, some it may occur late, much later in this stage. We've talked about, we defined puberty, and that part of puberty, is the process that results in sexual maturity. And again, which represents the ability to reproduce. And so it's important that we're aware of what sign kind of represents that for females and for males. For females, the beginning of the menstrual cycle. And for males is the production of sperm. Now, students tend not to get confused much in terms of the sign for females, but what do we need to be careful of with males, that we don't confuse the production of sperm with? And this often does occur. What isn't it necessarily? Sometimes we think of the sign for males is the ejaculation of semen. That doesn't and why does that not necessarily represent the sign of sexual maturity? No one will answer that one, huh? Well, a young male may actually have, early experiences of emission, but may not necessarily have produced viable sperm early on. So, and again, a lot of times we think of ejaculation, as being the sign, and it really is the production of sperm. And again, obviously that can occur very early on, but it's not, again, the ejaculation of semen being the sign. It is that production of sperm that obviously then will be contained in that, in the semen. But it's not that experience. It is that production of sperm, that again, represents the male's contribution to reproduction. All right. One of the things that we find with adolescence is that perception of body image is of great concern. And one of the things that we'll discuss a little bit later on is when we look at self-esteem, self-concept issues during this stage, that again, body image will emerge again, or we'll talk about it again. Here what we want to do is talk about, we've looked at the physical changes, and clearly, again, when we look at the definition of puberty, part of that definition talks about the process, and again, the ongoing process, that goes anywhere from 3 to 4 years, of which at the completion of that, not only is the result of that sexual maturity and the ability to reproduce, but it also results in us reaching our adult size, in that we begin to physically look more adult-like. And so one of the things we want to take a look at are the different experiences for males and females in terms of what we often refer to as early maturation versus on time and then late matures. And again, here we're talking not emotionally mature or socially mature, but in terms of physical maturity. And again, you all know somebody in your grade when you were going through who matured early. And you probably know some who clearly were what we often refer to as kind of late bloomers, or their, again, particularly the physical growth part of that occurred somewhat, later in that stage. Who do you think has, do you think it's an advantage or a disadvantage? Let's deal with it from male perspective first. Early maturation. You think males who mature early, they have advantages? Is it tend to be positive? What are the advantages? And then we'll talk some about if there are any disadvantages. Okay, and in what ways, and you don't have to answer that, but in what ways? And again, we'll put this, we'll put it up in a moment. It clearly tends to be an advantage for males. And in what ways would males have an advantage if they are physically maturing earlier? And there are probably 2 or 3 places, key places. There are many. Obviously, one of the main ones are sports. Clearly, if you have physically reached or moved into your growth spurt early, you're going to be taller, and you're going to be heavier, and then you're also going to be, in terms of sports, stronger. I mean, that's clearly going to give you an advantage in most sports. And it's real interesting. My son clearly has not hit his growth spurt, at all. But he's got a couple of kids in his class who have. And I mean, he stands up against them, and they just look really big. And they are in comparison to him. Now, he's probably where a lot of the kids in his class are. But you take someone who's hit that physical height growth spurt or is bulkier and stronger. Think of the advantage they have in football. I went to Marshfield 7th grade football game last night. And again, it's just, real interesting when you're watching the guys standing on the sidelines and watching those that clearly have not hit that growth spurt standing next to a couple who have. Or more, and again, my son doesn't play football, and I'm not disappointed that in the least, but watching the other parents in the stand, if your child is one of those that hasn't quite hit that growth spurt and they just got tackled by some kid who is almost twice their size. It's just like kind of grin and hope nothing had happened. And an interesting thing on the team last night is the fact that, and again, not a big surprise in terms of physical growth, we know that females mature, what do we remember? Faster. A couple of years, and so they actually had a girl on the team. And she was one of the largest players on the team, physically, size. And from everything I've been told, she can hold her own against virtually any guy on the team. So they're clearly, in terms of sports, an advantage. Can you think of another advantage for males who mature early? There's at least another probably, there's actually a couple of other ones. Clearly increasing status with their peers. And partly because they look what? I mean, as they begin to go through the physical kinds of changes moving towards adulthood, they look older. And we then translate or assume that not only do they look older, that we then assume that they are more mature. And in some ways, in some aspects, they may be. But what comes with it clearly is status, popularity within their peer group, which then also many times, because they look older, they may appear to be more mature. Because of that status and that popularity, then they are often given advantages in terms of leadership roles. Now, there's one other major place where they have a clear advantage. All still tied into status, popularity, the sports sports aspect of it relates to it. And so where do they have a clear advantage against some of the other males? Girls. And again, think about it. If I matured early, and again, if girls maturing 2 years earlier, that even within my own grade, girls are going to be probably more interested in me than other boys, other males of the same chronological age. Also, the males that mature earlier may actually have females interested in them who are Huh? Could be younger. They may even have the opportunity to attract the interest of some older girls, possibly. So they clearly have some advantages in that area. And again, if you think about it, if say you're a 7th or an 8th grader, and you haven't hit that maturity yet, who are the females, the girls in the 7th, 8th grade going to be most interested in? Huh? The young, again, the freshmen, well, in some cases, high school in general, they're not going to have a whole lot of interest in the boys that are within their age group because they haven't, in many cases, begin to not only go through the physical changes, but some of the other aspects of maturation as well. So clearly, males tend to have some real advantages. Can you think of any disadvantages for a male that has matured early? There's probably one. There are probably more, but one kind of stands out. Can you think of any disadvantage for a male who's physically matured early? Clearly dealing with some of the issues of being the first to change, without a doubt, and dealing with those changes when probably the majority are not, at the same time. Taking on roles, or at least one of the things that happens is, and this is true for females as well, but as they begin to mature early and begin to look more adult-like, there may be expectations that they now are what? Adults. Or that there may be expectations that they are going to behaviorally, emotionally, react more like someone who is older. Physically they look older, but they may not necessarily emotionally or socially or even cognitively, have matured in the same way that they have physically. And so we may put, in some cases, unrealistic expectations on their behavior. It's like they look mature, and so then we expect them to act more mature than what a typical 7th or 8th grader is likely going to do. So in a lot of ways, though they look older, their behavior may be much more characteristic of their peers or their age group. And so, again, the disadvantage may be unrealistic expectations put on them. Some may rise to those expectations and mature faster. What about females who mature early? What do you think? Advantages? Disadvantages? Are the advantages really? What do you think? Should be easy for you all to, majority of our class today is female, so not necessarily from your own personal experience, but from what you observed in terms of that stage of your life. What do you think? Particularly if it occurs really early on, particularly if it's occurring in late elementary school, tend to be more, others have more difficulty accepting that. If it happens more in junior high and a number of experiencing that, maybe not as much. But clearly if it happens very early, it tends to be a real struggle, particularly again in elementary school. What else do you think? Advantages, disadvantages? And again, think of it not so much really early maturation, but early, again, say in those junior high years. Can you think of anyone that you went to school with who matured early? And whether there were some advantages or disadvantages to that? Nobody can think of anyone? What's that? Can you think of one advantage? Yeah, I think clearly one of the advantages, and again, I think it's one of those that maybe tends to go both ways. Clearly from the female's perspective, it's going to be perceived as an advantage. I'm a 7th and 8th grade girl. I've matured early, and I'm going to get a lot of attention. I'm going to be noticed. Guys are going to pay attention to me. And not only guys, but what guys are likely going to pay attention to me? Older guys. Because again, a lot of the guys within my own age group likely have not matured yet, And again, with that 2-year difference, 7th and 8th grader, it's not all that unlikely that there may be, again, a freshman or someone, and there's nothing, that's pretty exciting from the girl's perspective, that there's this freshman that's interested in me, and so they do get a lot of attention. Now, what is the disadvantage of that? I think part of the difficulty is, are they emotionally mature enough and cognitively mature enough to handle that attention in ways that tend to be positive for them? Because they're going to get but again, remember, they're getting attention from older males, who, again, may be somewhat on a similar level that they are, but may be more advanced emotionally, cognitively, and clearly experientially may be more advanced. And are they able to handle at times the attention they're getting? And in some cases, are they able to handle some of the pressure that they may be, put upon them? Again, in many cases, and we hate to say it, but it's still true, in terms of some of the sexual advances. And do they have the emotional maturity to handle some of that with self-esteems that may be still a little bit fragile at 7th and 8th grade? And a belief that attention, which can really boost the self-esteem, but yet at the same time, there's maybe some real vulnerabilities that I feel inclined to have to respond to some of that pressure in order for guys to still like me and want to be with me. And again, just learning how to deal with those changes and to deal with those attention can be a challenge at times. And clearly, somewhat like with males, status is going to be impacted some, in popularity within groups. Clearly will be affected as well. And like with males, to some extent, it can be a positive in terms of, with more and more females now participating in organized sports, can be a clear advantage, as well. There's another kind of disadvantage. I'll kind of give you a hint. Do you think it has any effect on relationship with parents? And is that different for females than it is for males? I got a quick on that one. What do you think is the difference? And there really does tend to be, and I'm generalizing, but
females are confined more to the home, and they're protected more sexually.
Sure. Yeah, and again, it's interesting that males mature earlier, and yet parents don't tend to be as overly concerned about males, who obviously then are interacting with some other parent's daughter, who then are concerned, I think understandably, if they have a female who's matured earlier, again, physically, but then obviously are getting attention from guys, are getting some self-esteem kind of boost from that, who are likely going to want to do what earlier? That was what I was thinking about in terms of having sex, but possibly I was thinking of dating. No, it's not that. The other enters into the picture. I mean, if I'm allowed to start dating, and what we do know, I mean, the reality is those who date earlier are more likely to have sexual relationships earlier. There is a correlation there. But I was really thinking more of the, of that interest to want to start dating and going out and spending time with the other gender. And what's that do for parents when their 7th or 8th grader is wanting to do that? And who is looking older than 7th and 8th grade? Be a parent for a second. I have a boy, so I don't worry about it. I'm just kidding. I think parents kind of panic a little bit. Yeah, and if I had a daughter, what would be, based on, what I know about kind of what's going on during this kind of roller coaster stage of life, I would say lock her in her room until she's 21 or so,
The rule in my house, there were 7 of us, and nobody was allowed to date until they were 16.
16, yeah. So, yeah, and for some that would seem almost like, I don't know what your experience was like of that, but annoying, kind of feeling like in prison. Particularly again if a lot of the peers are again allowed to quote date or whatever, again at 14 and 15, 16 can seem like an awful long time, away. So it does have some impact on the parent-child relationship, and does tend to increase the level of intensity and potential conflict around that issue. that doesn't tend to, again, to be quite as prevalent with males. And again, even though the issues really in a lot of ways are the same, the concerns are different, and obviously the major concern is pregnancy, and what that would mean and the impact of that. And clearly the impact tends to be much greater for the female than for the male. So what we do find is that the positive effects of maturing early seem greater for males than for females. Again, there clearly are advantages to both, but I think the advantages for males tend to outweigh the disadvantages that females tend to experience. What do you think about on-time maturation? And on-time maturation just simply means that, again, adolescents are kind of maturing where the majority of, occurring at a time when the majority of their peers are going through the same changes. Positive, negative experience. It clearly tends to be more positive for both males and females. And again, I know it seems overly simplistic, but why would that be? You can relate to people. You feel, even though they're the advantages, you still, though, stand out. You are perceived, and you are, to some extent, feel somewhat different. If everyone else is kind of going through the same changes at the same time, I feel pretty, what? Normal, yeah. We hate to use the word normal and abnormal, but you feel normal. You're kind of right where everyone else is, and that feels comfortable. Now, finally, what about late matures? And again, I don't know if anyone in here that was their experience, but my guess is you know someone who that was their experience.
Easier for females to be late than males.
That may be true. I think what we tend to find is a different experience for both. And that may be because they're more generalized. Interesting. And you clearly nailed kind of what the disadvantages are, which are kind of the flip-flop of the advantages. But I'm not, what's interesting, and I'll put this up, is that I'm not sure that, I think what you said was true about the advantages is they may not be prone to some of the negative experiences that might come with early maturation, but I don't know how many of the adolescents perceive that themselves as being an advantage. I think it's a good point, and probably an accurate point, but I think from the perspective of the adolescent, what is their overriding feeling? Yeah, I mean, I think the overriding feeling is, or at least they're questioning or wondering or worrying, is there something wrong? I mean, again, if I'm a late mature, everyone else, again, remember the early matures have already gone, kind of are passing through, and then the majority of my peers are, and now I really am starting to feel out of place. And I'm beginning to worry, am I all right? Is there something wrong? And I think the big question for many are, and I know many females really struggle with it, and that is, will it happen for me? Will I experience the growth spurt? Will I experience the changes that everyone else seems to have gone through? And that can be real distressing. Wondering if and when that's going to happen, and everyone else reassuring it's okay. And in most cases, they're still within that range of normal development. But again, it's those places where we really feel kind of out of place. And again, even though it may in some ways protect them from some experiences to where emotionally and socially they may be more ready at the point when they go through the physical changes, again, a lot of adolescents may not perceive that as necessarily being a positive thing. So it does tend to be rather distressing for both. Feeling, again, and by this time I'm going to feel pretty left behind, when the majority have now begun to go through those changes. All right, we've looked at physical development of adolescence. And what we want to begin to do is to look at cognitive development of this stage. There are some unique things that are happening, and again, it's an ongoing evolution from the previous stages. We come out of middle childhood. Anyone remember what Piaget's stage was referred to as? Again, Piaget now, cognitive thoughts. Anyone remember? Excellent. Concrete operations, exactly. In this stage, Piaget's fourth stage is formal operations. And like I said, there are some things, again, as this thought processing are continuing to mature or continue to become more complex, we add some new dimensions to it. And these new dimensions, and again, one of the things that's characteristic of adolescence is pretty drastic changes in all the developmental domains. And the changes that take place here are pretty significant. During the concrete operations, again, everything was pretty steady, pretty even. There were things happening, but they weren't things that had a tremendous impact on relationships. Some of the things that are happening here cognitively do have a major impact, particularly on the parent-child relationship. Now, we're going to talk about how those relationships change when we get to social development. But what I want you to do is to think about, because what's important to understand is what's happening cognitively, as we've said all along, are impacting other areas. And clearly these cognitive changes are going to have a major impact both on my emotional development, but it has a tremendous impact on social relationships, particularly with parents. And we'll illustrate some of that. And then we'll come back to it again when we get to social development as well. So, formal operations, and these are just some of the characteristics. You might want to, again, underline, highlight some keywords. One of the characteristics of this stage is the kind of the evolving of what we call introspection. And that is the adolescent begins to think about thought. And so now they're actually able to think about what? Now, it may seem insignificant, but it is major. Introspection means I am now able to think about. What's this statement mean? What's it mean to think about thought? What you're feeling, or yeah, to think about what you feel, or simply to think about what you believe or think. Now, again, go back to middle childhood. If I told you something, and you were an elementary school kid, what are you most likely going to do with what I told you? Generally speaking, could be in one ear and out the other, or you're more likely to believe it and not do what? Question it. And part of the reason why you're not going to question a whole lot is you probably won't spend a lot of time thinking about it. Mom and dad or some other adult, teacher or something shares something with you, factual information or whatever it may be, or their thoughts about something or what you ought to do. And it doesn't mean that you're not capable of, but you're more likely or more inclined to kind of accept that at face value and to some extent believe that. And then what begins to happen all of a sudden is this kind of evolution where adolescents begin to really start to think about what they think. And so someone shares an idea or a thought or even a fact, and all of a sudden the adolescent stops and says, what do I think about that? And out of that they begin to realize what? And it's what sets the stage for social relationships or evolving social relationships. They really begin to form their own opinions, their own thoughts, their own beliefs, and that those may be what? Particularly in terms of parents. Different. And it's one of the challenges that parents really have is all of a sudden I don't understand why my child all of a sudden is doing what? Seemingly all the time. Well, rebelling or arguing. I used to tell them something or tell them what I think they ought to do, and they just did it. And now all of a sudden I share my wisdom with them, and then all of a sudden they don't like it. They don't agree with it. They argue about it, And I just don't understand what's going on. The other thing I hear a lot from parents that I work with of adolescents is, my teenager seems to spend a lot of time by themselves. Well, they seem to spend a lot of time thinking about stuff, and part of it is they are. Now, if you think about it, all of a sudden you become aware of your own thought processes, it's like opening up a whole new door. I can actually really begin to think about what I think about this, and it is out of that I'm beginning to form my own opinions, my own beliefs, my own values, and then I'm beginning to realize is that more and more, not that I haven't to some extent, but more and more realize that others share or may share different thoughts and opinions than I do. And then once I really realize that my peers have different thoughts and opinions, then what else must I do some more of? I got to think some more about what I think about that to see if I really think that what I think is really what I want to think or whether I should think more like peers, like my friends. Now, again, this is an evolutionary process. It's not like this overnight revelation. But you do find, and I don't know if you can remember back. I can. But I remember as a young adolescent that I spent a lot of time daydreaming. And my mind just kind of went, and I spent a lot of time thinking about stuff. And I did. I spent a lot of time by myself. I spent a lot of time in my room, really not doing a whole lot, but really just kind of thinking about things. And I mean, that kind of continued, on through those adolescent years. And again, part of it is that, that awareness, of my own thoughts, my own thought processes, and what that means. And again, that introspection is going to play into, some of these other characteristics. Another one has to do with their thought process become more abstract. If you'll remember when we were talking about middle childhood, one of the limitations, was that of abstract hypothetical thinking. That middle childhood was pretty much kind of tied to or kind of linked to what they knew, what their experiences had been at this point. And that's where the term concrete came from. Now as I begin to evolve through this stage, all of a sudden I can begin to think more abstractly. I can think in more dimensions of something. I can begin to generate and test hypotheses to ideas that, that I have. And I can begin to think about the possibilities of things that I have not yet experienced. I had a parent one time in a group that I was facilitating, and said, well, and she had an adolescent, and she says, but do they necessarily always use these new cognitive skills? I said, not necessarily. It's only what's evolving. And even though they may have this evolving thought processes, it doesn't necessarily mean that they always use them effectively, or very well sometimes, even though the capacity is increasing. Because what is the one thing that adolescents lack? Even though these skills are evolving, to do them efficiently and to use them efficiently is not refined real well at this early stage. Because why? Okay, clearly the communication skills are still pretty limited. One of the major things they're lacking is experience. They can think about the possibilities of things, and come up with reasons and explanations for things, but most of those are, for the most part, based on theories. They're ideas, not always based on experience. And of course, parents have the experiences, and so the parents know how these things are going to turn out. And so they spend a lot of time trying to convince the adolescent what? Of which the adolescent spends a lot of time trying to convince the parents the opposite. Parents believe what? And to some extent, it's probably true in terms of their teenager. Huh? Well, I'll rephrase that. That's probably what the adolescents often believe about the parents, that they don't know anything. Parents probably believe that they don't know anything, or probably, maybe to rephrase it, that they know better. I think parents believe, because of their experiences in life, that they know what is best for their adolescent. And so the adolescents are confronted with decisions and choices of life, and the adolescent wants to make those, and they want to do what? They want to find out for themselves. They are now capable of creating the hypothesis, but it becomes real important for them, apart from the fact that parents may or may not be right, of which many adolescents are convinced that their parents are wrong and out of touch, And so parents make the classic statement, when I was your age, of which, adolescents have a hard time to believe that their parents were ever their age. And even if they were their age, that was a different time period, so that no longer applies. And so for them, the motivation is, I need to figure this out myself. And also they begin to use, again, this evolving mental processes of thinking in several dimensions. They use this in terms of how they make choices and decisions. They also utilize it, and this is, again, comes into play with parent-teen relationships. They utilize it to give explanations for their behavior. And now what's different is this ability to think in multiple dimensions. For example, I come home, I'm a teenager, I come home late, past curfew, and so as a young adolescent, what am I going to attempt to do? And if I'm really skilled, I may get away with it. That wasn't what I was thinking of, but sneak in. So I attempt to sneak in, and I'm nailed. So now what am I going to do? Be the teenager. Excuses. And so I'm going to come up with my best excuse. What would be one reason why I'm late? Be a teenager. Car trouble. Excellent. What would be it? Now, if that one doesn't fly, what am I now capable of doing? Differently than maybe when I was middle childhood. So I shoot the car trouble out, and then my parents come back with a reason why that's not a good enough reason. Am I defeated? You're a teenager now. Why am I not defeated? I'll come up with something else. Exactly. So what else do I come up with? Be a teenager. Go back to your days. I'm sure somebody in here used it. Oh, well, I'm sorry? Excellent. Now, that one's getting harder these days when every teenager I know has a cell phone. But in my day, no phones, you know, and that would be one. Well, the phone was just not around. We were out, well, you want to be careful with it. We were out in the middle of nowhere. Would not probably be, probably would be more trouble. But that was one we used to use. The other one, I just lost track of time. You know, I just don't know how that happened. Now, there's another, you've gone through these lists of 4 or 5. These aren't flying. What would kind of be your ace in the hole? Doesn't necessarily work, but it's the one I'm going to pull out. You guys never used this one, huh? Maybe. Helping a friend. Had a friend who was in crisis. Because what we're thinking here is what? Because remember, this is my thought processes. I can come up with all these reasons why it justifies why what I supposedly did wrong is not so wrong. You know, and it's not like I just got one. Man, I got a bunch of them, you know, that I can kind of pull out. And so I'm hoping that I was helping a friend in crisis would somehow hit at the empathy of my parents, which may or may not fly, depending upon what they do with it. But the issue is that think about, I now can think in multiple dimensions. I can even think of possibilities that may or may not actually exist. Let's look at a couple of others. You be the teenager, teenage thought processes. I didn't do very well on that math test. What's the teenager? Because again, it's amazing if you talk to teenagers, they have got a bunch for this one. Blame it on the teacher. What else? What might we blame it on the teacher? Well, the teacher said that wasn't going to be on there. I don't know what went wrong. Teacher must have made a mistake. What else might a teenager say?
Scores of other students that theirs doesn't look so bad.
Yeah, excellent. You know, I didn't do really good. You know, I had 75%, but that was the 3rd highest grade. Everybody else did worse, so that should make mine seem pretty good. Yeah, exactly. Okay, that one didn't fly. What else might I come up with? Yeah, I know it's hard for you guys to jump back and think like a young teenager. This is one my son might likely pull out. Well, we can retake it. Or the extra credit. Well, I have all kinds of extra credit stacked up, you know, kinds of things. But again, able to think in multiple dimensions. Again, remember, they often kind of lack the kind of experiences, though, again, in their decision-making process. One of the things you find with teenagers, again, is they're, again, in this cause and effect and how they process information, this basic belief that they're talking to mom and dad or whoever and says, you know, the play's coming up and they've got a job after school, you know, and now they also want to be in the play. And what do they believe? They can do it all. Exactly. I can keep my grades up. I can balance the play. I can still work and still have time for my friends and everything else. You know, they really believe, and they have all kinds of explanations about how they're going to be able to juggle all those and do them well. Parents are going, there's not a chance in the world that you're going to be able to do that. The adolescent still believes that I can. They've got reasons, explanations, you know, for that. You know, another one, again, parent-teen dialogue. Again, teen processes. Spring break's coming up. You be mom and dad, I'll be the teenager. Spring break's coming up. Mom, 3 of my buddies, we thought we'd go down to Fort Lauderdale for spring break. Any problem with that? Would that be okay? No, we don't have room in the car. Get a bigger car. Okay. Well, we're going in my buddy's car, and it's only got a Volkswagen. What else would parents say? This is the interesting one, because what are teens going to attempt to do? Yeah, parents are going to come up with a lot. Parents are going to come up with a lot of logical things, and so what's a teenager likely to respond when parents hit them with that one? You know, I've been saving up money. I got plenty of money. Or we don't need a whole lot of money. You know, we're going to sleep out on the beach in tents. You know, kinds of things. Parents may raise the issue, you know, my favorite one, parents may raise the issue of safety, concern, unsupervised. Be a teenager, think ahead, got cell phones, no problem, Mom and Dad, got my cell phone right here. I'm going to call you all the time, tell you exactly what's going on. You know, again, teenagers are able to come up with all kinds of explanations of why something like that would be okay. And Mom and Dad, you know, you always told me you wanted me to experience life. Now, what better experience could I have than being down there, you know, with 15,000 other high school kids, you know, at spring break? Yeah, is that not an experience? You know, and you can begin to see the dialogue that's going back and forth in terms of parents' kinds of reasons for why that's not such a good decision, and the adolescent attempting in every way they possibly can of why that is a good situation or a good decision or why that would be a good thing. Again, like I said, one of the things that happens is again, adolescents are able to do cause and effect, you know, kind of reasoning, but a lot of times they don't always think through or able to think through the entire situation, you know, even though they may think that they have. And they are very creative sometimes in the ideas that they come up with. I mentioned that at the first of this discussion that I spent a little bit of time working residential care. And so I was involved for a short period of time working, actually was involved in starting a youth ranch for behavior disorder adolescents. And we started it from basically nothing, and we did get it up and running. And we had a small group of boys that were there fairly long term. And most of them had not come from the same geographical area, so none of them knew each other before getting there. And so two of them had struck up a friendship while they were there. And both of them had come to the conclusion that they had been there long enough. Now again, these were all wards of the courts, long-term placements, but they had decided they had been there long enough. So what were they going to do? Leave. Like I said, they had come to the conclusion they'd been there long enough. The one male had a girlfriend from the town that he had grew up in, and she came on occasions to visit during times when they could have visitors. And she began to bring a friend of hers, you know, another female friend. And of course, obviously you can begin to see how this played out. The female friend struck up a relationship with the other male. So now we have what? We have a hot date. We actually have a foursome now. We have a foursome. Anyway, long story short, what did this foursome, again, cognitive processes, they have come up with a decision, the four of them, that they're going to what? Any guesses?
Move in together?
You're a step ahead. We got a slight problem here. What's the little slight problem on the part of the males? They're wards of the court in a residential care facility. So living together, what's got to happen first? Huh? Got to get out. So they had come up with this plan that the two girls were going to rescue them and break them out. You know, again, thought process at work. And literally, they had processed this through. And long story short, the two girls had stole a relative's vehicle and were going to come, and they had made arrangements where they were going to rendezvous, you know, and a few other things. The only problem is that before the girls ever left the house, we knew about it. You know, the two girls did steal the vehicle, and they were on the road, of which by this time we have already notified the highway patrol. You know, so anyway, again, long story short, the two girls get picked up. They're now in custody.
How did you find out about it?
Word gets around, you know, not a lot of other people, you know, in the house, and plus it wasn't all that big of a secret. You know, you could kind of begin to put pieces together. So we knew long before it ever happened that it was going to happen, but we didn't confront the boys. We went ahead and just waited for it to play out. And so anyway, as we began to process this with the two boys, the two girls, like I said, are in custody. The two boys are still in the house, you know, of which we now begin to process this with them. And there were a few things, again, remember, they thought through a lot of things, not real well, but then we begin to talk about a couple of things they didn't think about. With the two boys, one of the things, and I was, you know, doing some of the therapy with them, was how were they planning on getting out of the house? See, the house has a security system, and they hadn't quite figured out how they were going to get around the security system, unless they were, shooting through the doors or whatever. Of course, like I said, they never even got to the point of ever getting, out of the house. And the questions I thought was most interesting was I asked them, where were you guys planning on going once you broke out? And the response was? Guesses?
To the girls' house?
No, good guess. They didn't know. What were you going to do when you got to where you didn't know you were going? Response? Don't know. Do you think you were going to be able to keep away from anyone ever finding you? Don't know. What were you planning on doing? And what were they planning on doing? That's as far as their thought process had got them. They were going to get in the car and drive. That's just, and so again, they had used their thought process to think through a number of the steps, but clearly hadn't used all of them to think very far. And the bottom line is they were totally unconcerned or worried, that they would be able to take care of themselves. And part of the reasons why they were going to be able to take care of themselves, they were at 16, 17. They were definitely invincible, and even more important than their invincibility, they were supposedly adults, and adults who are in love. Hot date, driving off, into the sunset. Kind of interesting. So again, there is this evolution thought processes that are taking place. But as the parent wants to ask, and my response was, it doesn't necessarily mean that it takes a while to perfect the use of the thought processes. But they do use these thought processes and these expanding abilities to reason, which often contributes to some of the increased arguments, confrontations with parents and adolescents kind of going round and round about how life, should be, ought to be. Next time we'll take a look at 3 of the other characteristics of this stage of thought process, and they're pretty interesting too.